A husband begins to suspect something isn't right when his loyal dog starts acting strangely every time his wife's friend comes over. At first, he brushes it off. But then the dog does something that leaves him no choice but to investigate. What he uncovers will not only shatter his trust but change his life forever. How did the dog reveal the truth? And what happens when his wife's secrets spiral out of control? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun cast long shadows across the kitchen as Mark reached for his favorite coffee mug, a well-worn ceramic piece decorated with architectural sketches. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the scent of buttered toast, and Scout's tail thumped rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The golden retriever's warm brown eyes followed Mark's every move, hoping for a morning treat, his expression a perfect mix of patience and anticipation. James said he could help us with the yard work this weekend, Laura mentioned, her fingers sliding across her phone screen with practiced indifference. She sat perched on a kitchen stool, still in her silk robe, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. He's good with landscaping, you know. Says he's done lots of garden renovations. Mark nodded, his mind already racing through the slides for his client presentation. The Henderson project had consumed his thoughts for weeks. He grabbed a banana from the fruit bowl and broke off a piece, tossing it to Scout, who caught it mid-air with characteristic grace. "Mark, are you even listening?" Laura's voice carried a hint of irritation, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the kitchen counter. "Yes, sorry. James, yard work, weekend." He smiled apologetically and sat down beside her with his coffee and a piece of toast, the ceramic mug clinking softly against the marble countertop. Scout settled between their stools, his head resting on Mark's foot, a warm and comforting presence. Laura reached down to adjust Scout's collar, her bracelet jingling softly. "Come on, boy, time to go outside." The normally gentle dog let out a low growl, showing his teeth, his hackles rising visibly. Laura pulled her hand back quickly, her expression flickering between surprise and anger. "Scout!" Mark's voice was stern, but puzzled. "That's not like him at all." He reached down to pat the dog's head soothingly. "He's been acting weird lately," Laura said, shooting Scout a hard look as she adjusted her robe. "I'll take him for a walk later. Maybe he just needs more exercise." Her tone was dismissive, almost cold. Mark glanced at his watch. 7:15 a.m. He needed to get moving. The Henderson project wouldn't present itself, and his clients were notoriously punctual. He grabbed his briefcase and laptop bag, then bent down to ruffle Scout's golden fur. The dog's tail wagged happily, all traces of aggression gone, his eyes bright with devotion. "See you tonight," Mark said, giving Laura a quick kiss. She smiled, but her eyes stayed fixed on her phone, the screen's blue light reflecting in her dark eyes. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the fresh scent of newly mowed grass. As Mark walked to his car, he spotted James in the neighboring yard, examining some shrubs with what appeared to be professional interest. The neighbor raised his hand in a casual greeting, his smile wide and friendly, and Mark returned the wave automatically. From behind the fence, Scout's sharp barks pierced the morning quiet, echoing against the houses. Something about the sound made Mark pause for a moment. It wasn't Scout's usual friendly bark, but something more urgent, more warning. Mark shook off the uneasy feeling and climbed into his car, his mind already shifting to the workday ahead, though Scout's unusual behavior lingered at the edges of his thoughts. The sun had already set when Mark's car pulled into the driveway. His shoulders ached from the long day, and the digital clock on his dashboard read 8:45 p.m. As he unlocked the front door, Scout bounded toward him with unusual energy, tail wagging frantically. The golden retriever kept pushing his wet nose against Mark's hand, then turning to look at the door with a soft growl rumbling in his throat. "Hey, boy, what's got you so worked up?" Mark patted Scout's head, noticing how the dog's muscles seemed tense under his fur. "It's pretty late for you to be this energetic." Laura's voice drifted from the living room. "Your dinner's in the microwave. The presentation ran late?" "Yeah, the Hendersons had a lot of questions." Mark made his way to the kitchen, Scout following close at his heels. The microwave hummed as he reheated his plate of pasta. Scout continued his unusual behavior, alternating between nudging Mark's hand and growling softly at the door to the backyard. Settling at the kitchen table with his warm dinner, Mark twirled pasta around his fork. "How was your day?" "Productive," Laura replied from the doorway, her phone in hand as usual. "James came over to help with the bushes in the backyard. They really needed pruning." She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "He's been such a helpful neighbor since we met. Knows so much about landscaping." At the mention of James's name, Scout's growl grew louder, his eyes fixed on Laura. The sound was deep and threatening, completely unlike his usual friendly demeanor. "Scout, that's enough," Mark said firmly, though confusion creased his brow. The dog had never acted this way before, especially not toward Laura. Scout fell quiet, but remained alert, his body tense. Later that night, Mark lay in bed, trying to relax after the long day. The bedroom was quiet except for the soft whir of the ceiling fan and Scout's clicking nails on the hardwood floor. The dog paced back and forth near the door, occasionally stopping to stare at Laura with an intensity that seemed almost human. "I think he's mad at you," Mark said with a small laugh, watching Scout's unusual behavior. Laura didn't look up from her novel. "He's just being weird," she said dismissively, rolling over to face away from both Mark and Scout. "You're reading too much into it." Mark watched Scout for a few more moments, the dog's strange behavior adding to a nagging feeling he couldn't quite place. He made a mental note to pay closer attention to Scout's odd reactions in the coming days. Something wasn't quite right, but he couldn't put his finger on what. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Mark's kitchen as he rubbed sleep from his eyes. Laura's side of the bed had been empty when he woke, her running shoes missing from their usual spot by the door. Scout stood at the back door, whining with increasing urgency, his tail straight and stiff. Okay, boy, let's get you outside." Mark opened the door and Scout burst through like a golden bullet. The dog's usual playful morning energy was replaced by focused intensity as he charged toward the fence, barking furiously. James stood on the other side, pressed close to the wooden slats with gardening tools in his hands. His head snapped up at Scout's approach, and he took a quick step backward. "Morning," Mark called out, walking toward the fence. "You're up early." "Oh, hey, Mark." James shifted the tools awkwardly in his hands. Just, checking the property lines. Want to make sure I'm not overstepping when I do my gardening." Something in James's tone made Mark's stomach tighten. Scout continued barking, his fur bristling along his spine. "Scout, quiet!" Mark commanded, though he noticed how James wouldn't quite meet his eyes. Back inside, Mark had barely started making his coffee when Laura breezed through the door, her cheeks flushed from running. Her workout clothes were damp with sweat as she grabbed a water bottle from the fridge. "Great morning for a run," she said, taking a long drink. "Ran into James out there. He's really serious about his garden, isn't he? Even checks the property lines at sunrise." Mark's hand paused as he reached for a coffee mug. The comment seemed too casual, too coincidental. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on pouring his coffee. "Yeah, I saw him out there," Mark replied, watching Laura's expression carefully. She didn't seem to notice, busy typing on her phone. Before leaving for work, Mark knelt down to give Scout an extra long pat goodbye. The dog's brown eyes looked up at him with what seemed like concern, and Mark found himself lingering longer than usual. At his office, Mark struggled to focus on the blueprints spread across his desk. His mind kept drifting back to Scout's aggressive barking, to James's nervous explanation, to Laura's casual mention of running into him. The morning's events played on repeat in his thoughts. During lunch, Mark pulled out his phone and dialed Laura's number. Each ring seemed to stretch longer than usual until she finally answered. "Hey," she said, her voice distracted and slightly breathless. "Just checking in. How's your day going?" "Fine. Busy here with chores." Her words came out clipped and rushed. "I should go." The line went dead before Mark could respond. He stared at his phone, that nagging feeling of unease growing stronger in his chest. Mark's key turned in the lock just past 7 that evening. The house was quiet, except for the soft glow of the living room lamp, where Laura sat curled on the couch, her fingers moving quickly across her phone screen. Scout lay nearby, his eyes fixed on Laura with unusual intensity. The dog's typical excited greeting was absent, no wagging tail or happy bounds toward the door. "Hey," Mark called out, setting down his briefcase. Laura startled slightly, her phone disappearing into her lap. "Oh, you're home. I didn't hear you come in." Scout's head remained still, his gaze unwavering from Laura's position on the couch. Mark noticed how the dog's body seemed tense, like a coiled spring. During dinner, Mark pushed his pasta around his plate, gathering his thoughts. "Did you hear about the Reynolds house down the street? Someone broke in last week." "Really?" Laura took a sip of water, her expression neutral. "Yeah, and apparently there have been a few other break-ins nearby." Mark watched her reaction carefully. "I've been thinking we should install a security system." Laura shrugged, twirling pasta around her fork. "If you think it's necessary, it would probably give us peace of mind." "I'll look into it tomorrow," Mark said, purposely keeping his voice casual. He didn't mention his plans for the backyard camera. Something about Laura's indifference made him hold back that detail. After Laura announced she was tired and headed upstairs, Mark settled into his home office with his laptop. Scout padded in behind him, lying down at his feet with a soft woof. The glow of the screen illuminated Mark's face as he scrolled through security system reviews, comparing features and installation requirements. Scout's head rested on Mark's foot, his brown eyes following every movement on the screen. Mark reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "We'll get to the bottom of whatever's bothering you, boy," Mark murmured. Scout's ears instantly perked up, his head lifting as if he understood every word. With a deep breath, Mark clicked the purchase button on the security system, including the hidden backyard camera. The confirmation email arrived moments later, promising delivery within 2 days. The weekend arrived with a mix of anticipation and unease as Mark unpacked the security system components across the kitchen counter. The morning sun filtered through the windows while he studied the installation manual, organizing cameras, sensors, and wires into neat piles. "I'm heading out for some errands," Laura announced, grabbing her purse. She barely glanced at the equipment spread across the counter. "Need anything while I'm out?" "No, I'm good," Mark replied, noting her lack of interest. Scout watched her leave from his spot near Mark's feet, his posture relaxing as the front door closed. Mark worked methodically, mounting cameras in strategic locations. He positioned one discreetly above the living room window, angling it to capture the entire space, where Scout often displayed his unusual behavior. The backyard camera proved trickier. He wanted it hidden, but with a clear view of the fence line shared with James's property. As he adjusted the backyard camera's position, Scout's low growl caught his attention. The dog stood rigid, staring intently toward James's house. Mark paused his work, following Scout's gaze, but saw nothing unusual. "What is it, boy?" Mark asked softly, stepping down from the ladder. Scout's tail remained still, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the fence. Mark checked the camera feed on his phone, adjusting the angle to capture exactly where Scout was looking. The dog's behavior sent a chill down his spine. Scout had always been an excellent judge of character. Mark knelt beside his faithful companion, running a hand through his golden fur. "You've been trying to tell me something, haven't you?" Scout turned to look at him, his brown eyes seeming to hold secrets Mark couldn't yet understand. When Laura returned home that evening, Mark kept his tone casual as he mentioned the installation. "Got everything set up," he said over dinner. "Basic stuff. Door sensors, motion detectors. Should help us sleep better at night." "That's good," Laura replied, her attention more focused on her phone than the conversation. "James mentioned his cousin had a break-in last month. Better safe than sorry." Mark nodded, carefully avoiding any mention of the cameras or his plans to monitor them from work. Scout sat beside his chair, tail wagging gently, as if approving of Mark's discretion. The dog's presence felt reassuring, like a silent ally in whatever mystery was unfolding in their home. Mark's fingers drummed nervously on his desk as his phone buzzed with the first security alert. He glanced around the quiet office before opening the app, his heart racing slightly. The live feed showed their backyard, where Scout's agitated barking filled the audio. The scene made Mark's breath catch. Laura and James stood by the fence, far closer than casual neighbors would normally be. Scout circled them, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by fierce, protective barking. Mark's hands felt cold as he watched. With trembling fingers, he tapped the rewind button. The footage played back, showing Laura approaching the fence first, then James joining her. Mark's throat tightened as he observed their body language, James leaning in, invading Laura's personal space in a way that seemed far too familiar. Laura's response made his stomach churn. Her easy laugh, the casual touch of her hand on James's arm, lingering longer than it should. "It could be nothing," Mark whispered to himself, trying to quiet the alarm bells ringing in his head. He watched the clip 3 more times, each viewing making him feel slightly sicker. His architect's eye for detail caught every subtle movement, the way Laura tucked her hair behind her ear, how James's body angled toward her, the comfortable intimacy of their stance. Still, Mark tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was reading too much into friendly neighbor interaction. Maybe his recent stress was making him paranoid. He saved the clip carefully, labeling it with the date and time, then minimized the app. The rest of his workday passed in a fog of distraction and worry. That evening, the kitchen felt unusually quiet during dinner. Mark pushed his food around his plate, his appetite gone. Scout lay faithfully at his feet, a warm, steady presence against his legs. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Laura commented, breaking the silence. She reached across the table for the salt shaker, and Scout's sudden growl made them both jump. "Just tired," Mark replied, his voice flat. "Big project at work." He watched as Laura withdrew her hand quickly, shooting an annoyed look at Scout. The dog's growl subsided to a low rumble, his eyes fixed on Laura. Mark felt the weight of Scout's head against his shoe, a gesture that suddenly seemed less like simple affection and more like solidarity. He reached down to scratch behind Scout's ears, wondering what else those loyal eyes had witnessed when he wasn't around. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of forks against plates and Scout's occasional shifting at Mark's feet. Every time Mark glanced at Laura, he saw the scene from the security footage playing in his mind, her hand on James's arm, that laugh he used to think belonged only to him. Mark's office routine had shifted. Between client meetings and design reviews, he found himself checking his phone more frequently, drawn to the security app like a moth to flame. Each notification made his heart skip, each new clip adding another piece to a puzzle he didn't want to complete. The footage told a story in fragments. Laura spending more time in the backyard than she ever had before. James finding endless excuses to be near their fence. Mark watched their interactions with growing unease. The way Laura's eyes crinkled when she laughed at James's jokes. How James's gaze followed her movements, the casual touches that seemed to linger too long. One morning, Mark witnessed James helping Laura with garden work that she could have easily handled alone. His wife's body language spoke volumes. The way she tilted her head, how she stood just a bit too close. Scout circled them constantly, his barking a persistent warning that neither seemed to heed. During breakfast the next day, Mark stirred his coffee slowly, gathering courage. Scout lay nearby, alert and watchful. "James sure spends a lot of time here," Mark said, trying to keep his voice casual. He glanced up from his mug. "He doesn't seem busy with his own house." Laura's shoulders tensed slightly before she shrugged. "He's just being neighborly," she said, reaching for the toast. "Did you hear about the new restaurant downtown? Sarah says it's amazing." Before Mark could press further, Scout's sharp bark cut through the air, making Laura jump. The dog stood rigid, staring at her with unusual intensity. That evening, Mark sat in his favorite armchair, pretending to read while watching Laura from the corner of his eye. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Each time she smiled slightly before typing responses, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Who are you talking to?" Mark asked, his voice slightly strained. Laura didn't look up. "Just a friend," she replied, her tone dismissive. Later, lying in bed, Mark stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Scout lay at the foot of the bed, twitching and growling softly in his sleep, as if even in his dreams he was trying to protect his master from uncomfortable truths. Mark sat at his desk, reviewing blueprints for a new project when his phone buzzed. Another security notification. His hand trembled slightly as he opened the app, dreading what he might see. The live feed showed his backyard, where Laura stood near the rose bushes she'd planted last spring. James was there too, closer than any neighbor should be. Mark's throat tightened as he watched James place his hand on Laura's shoulder, both of them laughing at some private joke. Scout circled them frantically, his barking clear even through the phone's speaker. Mark's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold. With quick, angry taps, he captured screenshots of the interaction, saving them to a folder he'd created specifically for these moments. His coffee sat cold beside him, forgotten as anger and hurt churned in his stomach. That evening, Mark pushed his salmon around his plate, barely tasting it. Scout lay under the table, his head resting on Mark's feet. The dining room felt heavy with unspoken words. "Did James stop by today?" Mark asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. He watched Laura's face, noting how her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Laura hesitated, her eyes flickering briefly to the side before meeting his. "No, I haven't seen him," she said, the lie falling easily from her lips. Scout's growl rumbled through the room, low and warning. Laura shot the dog an irritated look before returning to her meal. Later that night, Mark sat in his home office, the blue glow of his laptop screen illuminating his tired face. Laura had gone to bed an hour ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his loyal companion. Scout sat beside his chair, watching intently as Mark replayed the footage from earlier that day. The evidence was there, the touches, the lies, the secret meetings. Mark's finger hovered over the save button before downloading the video to his phone. Each new piece of proof felt like another crack in his heart. "You might be onto something, buddy," Mark whispered to Scout, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Scout leaned into his touch, offering silent support as Mark realized with growing certainty that he needed more concrete evidence before confronting what was happening in his own backyard. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Mark stirred his coffee mechanically, his mind heavy with thoughts he couldn't shake. Scout sat loyally at his feet, occasionally nudging his leg for attention. Laura breezed into the kitchen, her smile too bright, her movements almost theatrical. "I've got such a busy day planned," she announced, pulling out a yogurt from the fridge. "Need to pick up dry cleaning, grab groceries, and meet Sarah for lunch." Her voice carried an artificial cheerfulness that made Mark's stomach twist. He nodded, taking a sip of his coffee to hide his expression. Scout's ears perked up at Laura's voice, but not in his usual friendly way. The dog's body remained tense, watching her every move. At work, Mark tried to focus on his latest project, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone. When the security notification came through around noon, his heart rate spiked. Opening the app, he felt his world tilt sideways. The footage showed James, casual as could be, slipping through their side gate like he owned the place. Scout's reaction was immediate and fierce, barking and lunging toward the intruder. Laura appeared quickly, her hands making calming gestures toward Scout while ushering James inside. The casual familiarity of their interaction made Mark's blood boil. He replayed the clip 3 times, his hands shaking with each viewing. His finger hovered over the call button, ready to confront Laura. But he stopped himself. He needed more than this. He needed something absolutely undeniable. That evening, Mark sat across from Laura at their dining table, pushing his pasta around his plate. Scout lay at his feet, a warm, steady presence against his leg. "How was your day?" Mark asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Get everything done on your list?" Laura nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, yes. The dry cleaning was ready early for once, and Sarah and I had the most wonderful lunch at that new cafe downtown." She launched into a detailed story about the cafe's menu, her words flowing too smoothly, too rehearsed. Scout's eyes never left Laura. His usual warm brown gaze turned sharp and watchful. When she reached for her water glass, he let out a low rumble. "Scout, honestly," Laura scolded, but Mark noticed the slight tremor in her voice. Mark watched his wife talk, noting how she wove her lies with such ease, never once mentioning James or his uninvited visit. Each omission felt like another betrayal, another confirmation of what he feared most. The truth was there in what she didn't say, in the careful construction of her alternate version of the day. The early morning air felt crisp as Mark clipped Scout's leash on, hoping the walk would help clear his jumbled thoughts. Scout trotted beside him, his golden fur catching the first rays of sunlight. Their usual route took them past several quiet houses, but today Scout had other ideas. As they approached James's property, Scout's demeanor changed. His ears perked up and his body went rigid. He pulled Mark toward the fence line, his leash going taut. There, parked in James's driveway, sat an unfamiliar car, a sleek silver sedan that definitely wasn't James's usual pickup truck. Scout's barking echoed through the quiet morning. "Easy, boy," Mark whispered, trying to calm him, but the dog wouldn't let up. Something about that car bothered Scout, and Mark felt his own unease growing. He tugged gently on the leash, but Scout remained fixed in place, his barking now mixed with low growls. Back home, Mark unclipped Scout's leash and headed to the kitchen for coffee. That's when he noticed Laura's designer purse sitting on the counter, carelessly left open. He stood there for a moment, his conscience wrestling with his suspicions. Finally, his need for truth won out. With trembling fingers, he reached into the purse. Among the usual items, makeup, wallet, keys, his hand found a crumpled piece of paper. Smoothing it out, his heart sank. It was a receipt for Pine Grove Cabins, dated for the upcoming weekend. The reservation was under James Carter. Mark's hands went cold as he read the details. A 2-night stay, romantic package upgrade, champagne service. The sound of Laura's car pulling into the driveway snapped him back to reality. He quickly stuffed the receipt back into her purse, trying to arrange everything exactly as he'd found it. Scout positioned himself near Mark, his protective stance obvious. Laura breezed in through the door, carrying shopping bags. "Hey, you're up early," she said brightly. Mark held up the receipt, which he'd kept. "Want to explain this?" Laura's smile faltered for just a second before returning, now slightly forced. "Oh, you weren't supposed to find that yet," she laughed, but the sound was nervous, artificial. "I was planning a surprise weekend getaway for us. James helped me book it, since he knows the owner." Scout's low growl filled the silence that followed. Laura stepped around him to put her bags down, and the growl intensified. Mark watched her face, noting how she wouldn't quite meet his eyes as she busied herself with the shopping bags. He nodded slowly, pretending to accept her explanation, but the bitter taste of her lies made him feel sick. The evening sun cast long shadows across the living room as Laura touched up her lipstick by the hallway mirror. "Just going out with the girls," she announced, adjusting her dress, one Mark hadn't seen before. "Don't wait up." Mark kept his eyes on his laptop, forcing his voice to stay casual. "Have fun." He waited until he heard her car pull away before opening the security app. Scout paced near the front door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. His whines grew more insistent as minutes ticked by. The security footage showed Laura's car turning right instead of left, the opposite direction from her usual spots downtown. Mark's stomach churned. Scout's whining turned to urgent barking, his nose pressed against the door. "Okay, buddy," Mark said, grabbing his jacket and flashlight. "Show me what's bothering you." The moment Mark opened the door, Scout bolted into the darkness. His golden fur disappeared into the tree line behind their property, his bark echoing through the woods. Mark clicked on his flashlight and followed, branches crunching under his feet. The path Scout chose wasn't one Mark recognized. They passed familiar landmarks, the old oak with the twisted trunk, the moss-covered boulder, but Scout led them deeper into unfamiliar territory. The dog would pause occasionally, looking back to make sure Mark followed, before charging ahead again. The woods grew thicker, the evening air cooler under the dense canopy. Mark's flashlight beam bounced off tree trunks and undergrowth, creating strange shadows. Scout's barking suddenly changed pitch, more urgent, more focused. They emerged into a small clearing, and Mark's heart stopped. There, nestled among the trees, stood a rustic cabin. Light spilled from its windows, creating a deceptively cozy glow. But nothing felt cozy about the sight of Laura's red sedan parked beside James's silver car. Scout crouched low, a continuous growl rumbling in his chest. Mark stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, his flashlight beam trembling slightly as it illuminated the cabin's entrance. The sound of laughter drifted through a partially opened window. Laura's laugh, the one she used when she was trying to be quietly flirtatious. Mark's chest tightened, each breath becoming harder than the last. Scout pressed against his leg, still growling, as if offering support while simultaneously warning of danger. The cabin's door was just 30 feet away, and Mark found himself taking a step forward, then another. Mark crept closer to the cabin, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. Scout stayed close, his growls now barely audible. The warm light from the window created long shadows across the clearing as Mark positioned himself where he could see inside, without being noticed. His heart clenched at the scene before him. Laura sat on a plush couch, wineglass in hand, her head thrown back in laughter at something James had said. They were sitting close, too close. James's arm draped casually across the back of the couch behind her, his body angled toward her in a way that spoke of intimacy. Mark's hand shook as he pulled out his phone. Scout pressed against his leg, a steady presence in the growing darkness. Through the window, he could see James lean in closer, whispering something in Laura's ear. She giggled, playfully swatting his arm. The casual touches, the knowing looks. It was all there, plain as day. With trembling fingers, Mark pressed record on his phone. He forced himself to keep the camera steady as he documented their betrayal. James poured more wine into Laura's glass, their fingers brushing deliberately. Laura's wedding ring caught the light as she reached for the glass, the sight of it making Mark's stomach turn. Scout's growl grew louder suddenly, and Mark quickly stepped back into the shadows. His heart pounded as he checked the recording. 3 minutes and 17 seconds of undeniable proof. The urge to burst through the cabin door was overwhelming, but Mark forced himself to think clearly. This wasn't the time or place for confrontation. "Come on, buddy," he whispered to Scout, backing away from the window. They retreated silently through the woods, leaving the warm glow of the cabin behind them. Back in his living room, Mark sat heavily on the couch, the weight of what he'd witnessed pressing down on him. Scout jumped up beside him, resting his head on Mark's lap. The golden retriever's eyes watched him with concern as Mark played the video again. The footage was crystal clear. Laura and James, their betrayal captured in high definition. Mark's finger hovered over the delete button for a moment before he saved the video to a secure folder. "You were right all along, buddy," Mark whispered, scratching behind Scout's ears. The dog whined softly in response, pressing closer as Mark stared at his phone screen, his eyes reflecting both deep hurt and rising anger. Mark opened his eyes to another morning, the weight of last night's discovery making his chest feel heavy. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, but it did nothing to warm the chill inside him. Scout's familiar weight pressed against his legs, a constant comfort in this new reality. In the kitchen, Laura hummed while making pancakes, acting as if everything was normal. Her cheerful demeanor felt like sandpaper against Mark's raw emotions. "I thought we could have breakfast together before work," Laura said brightly, sliding a plate in front of him. Scout growled softly as she passed, making her step back quickly. "Thanks," Mark managed, forcing himself to take a bite. The pancakes tasted like cardboard in his mouth. Now, throughout breakfast, Laura chatted about neighborhood gossip and weekend plans, while Mark nodded at appropriate moments. His mind raced with all the things he wanted to say. The confrontation he'd rehearsed a dozen times in his head already. But each time he opened his mouth to speak, he stopped himself. No. He needed to be smart about this. The evidence had to be organized, secured. He couldn't risk Laura deleting anything or covering her tracks. As the day progressed, Mark watched Laura with new eyes. She disappeared into the bathroom with her phone 3 times before noon. Her screen always faced away from him when she typed, and she jumped slightly whenever he walked near. Each suspicious action confirmed what he already knew. That night, after Laura had gone to bed, Mark sat in his home office with Scout by his side. The golden retriever's head rested heavily on his lap as Mark opened his laptop. He created a new folder and began methodically saving everything. The cabin footage came first, the damning evidence of Laura and James together. Then the security camera screenshots showing their innocent backyard meetings. Mark's hand shook slightly as he scanned the cabin receipt, saving it alongside the rest. One by one, he documented the lies. The text message timestamps that didn't match Laura's stories. The security footage showing James entering their property when Laura claimed she hadn't seen him. Scout shifted closer as Mark worked, offering silent support as his master's world continued to crumble. "What am I supposed to do with all this, buddy?" Mark whispered, scratching behind Scout's ears. The dog looked up at him with understanding eyes, as if he knew exactly how much pain Mark was in. Mark stared at the growing folder of evidence on his screen, each file a piece of his shattered trust. Scout's steady presence anchored him as he organized the proof of his wife's betrayal, preparing for the confrontation he knew would come. The morning sun cast long shadows across the backyard as Mark carefully positioned the new camera. He'd chosen a spot behind the dense foliage of their maple tree, where the small device would be invisible but capture everything perfectly. Scout watched attentively from the patio, his golden fur catching the early light as his tail wagged steadily while Mark tested different angles. The loyal dog seemed to understand the importance of his master's task. "There we go," Mark muttered, finally satisfied with the placement. The camera had a clear view of the entire backyard, especially the corner where Laura and James usually met. His hands trembled slightly as he made the final adjustments, fighting back the bile rising in his throat at what he might discover. Inside the house, Laura was getting ready for her evening plans. She breezed through the kitchen in her workout clothes, water bottle in hand. Her designer yoga mat was slung casually over her shoulder, a recent purchase she'd been showing off frequently. "I'm heading to yoga class tonight," she announced, adjusting her ponytail with practiced casualness. "Probably won't be back until 8 or so." Mark nodded without looking up from his laptop, where he was checking the new camera's feed. "Have fun," he said flatly, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on the keyboard. Later that evening, as Mark sat at his desk reviewing work documents, his phone buzzed with a notification. His heart pounded as he opened the security app, his mouth going dry with anticipation. The new camera's crystal-clear footage showed Laura and James in the backyard, standing close together. Mark's hands clenched into fists as he watched James lean in and kiss Laura quickly, before they both hurried toward the front of the house, looking furtively over their shoulders. Mark switched to the front yard camera, just in time to see them climbing into James's car, their movements quick and practiced. The footage was undeniable. No more room for doubt or excuses. His throat felt tight as he saved the video files, adding them to his growing collection of evidence. Each new file felt like another nail in the coffin of his marriage. When Laura returned home hours later, her cheeks were flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. She found Mark in the living room, pretending to watch TV with Scout, who lay protectively at his feet. "How was your day?" she asked cheerfully, setting down her gym bag. The scent of unfamiliar cologne lingered faintly around her. "Fine," Mark replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger churning inside him. "Just worked late." His fingers absently stroked Scout's fur, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. "You should take a break sometimes," Laura said, heading toward the stairs. "You work too hard." Her voice carried a note of condescension that Mark had never noticed before. Scout lifted his head and growled as she passed, causing her to step quickly away. The dog's hackles were raised, his usually gentle demeanor replaced with obvious hostility. Mark reached down to pat Scout's head, grateful for his companion's unwavering loyalty. "Soon, buddy," he whispered once Laura was out of earshot. "Not yet." The words were both a promise and a prayer, heavy with the weight of decisions yet to come. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows as Mark sat at the counter, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was barely above a whisper as he spoke with the divorce lawyer, carefully detailing the evidence he'd collected over the past weeks. "Yes, I have video footage, text messages, and receipts," Mark explained quietly, glancing toward the stairs to ensure Laura was still asleep. Scout lay at his feet, ears perked up attentively. The lawyer's voice crackled through the phone. "Don't confront her yet. We need to protect your interests first. Act normal and start securing your assets discreetly." Mark nodded, jotting down notes on a small pad. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, but his resolve remained firm. "I understand. I'll start today." During his lunch break, Mark drove to his best friend Tom's house, carrying a small box of important papers: birth certificate, financial documents, and family photographs he couldn't bear to lose. Scout's favorite toys and spare leash were tucked carefully at the bottom. "Stay as long as you need," Tom assured him, helping Mark carry the box inside. "The spare room is yours." Back at home, Mark maintained a careful facade of normalcy. When Laura asked about his schedule for the week, he kept his voice steady. "I'll be working late most nights," he said, organizing some files on his laptop. "Big project coming up." She barely looked up from her phone. "That's fine. I have plans with friends anyway." The lies came easier to her now, Mark noticed. Each casual deception strengthened his resolve. As evening settled in, Mark continued his quiet preparations. He transferred important files to a secure drive, documented his personal belongings, and updated his banking information. Scout followed him from room to room, as if understanding the importance of their subtle movements. Later that night, with Laura sleeping upstairs, Mark sat in his home office, reviewing his carefully crafted plan. Scout rested his head on Mark's knee, offering silent support. The golden retriever's warm presence helped steady Mark's nerves as he double-checked every detail. "We're almost there," Mark whispered, scratching behind Scout's ears. The dog's tail thumped softly against the floor in response, his loyal eyes never leaving Mark's face. The sun was setting when Laura grabbed her purse, heading for the door. "Don't wait up," she called out cheerfully. "Just drinks with the girls." Mark looked up from his laptop, keeping his expression neutral. "Have fun," he replied, watching as she left. Scout sat beside him, tail twitching with anticipation. As soon as Laura's car disappeared down the street, Mark grabbed his phone and jacket. "Let's go, buddy," he whispered to Scout. The golden retriever followed him quietly to the car, jumping into the back seat with practiced ease. They drove carefully, maintaining a safe distance behind Laura's vehicle. Scout's breath fogged the window as he watched the familiar route to the cabin unfold. When Laura's car turned onto the dirt road leading to the woods, Mark parked his car in a hidden spot and continued on foot with Scout. The evening air was crisp as they made their way through the trees. Scout moved silently beside Mark, his training evident in every careful step. They approached the cabin from the back, where thick bushes provided perfect cover. Mark positioned himself near a partially open window, his phone ready to record. Scout sat obediently at his feet, ears alert but maintaining complete silence. Through the window, Laura's voice drifted clearly. "Mark doesn't suspect a thing," she said, laughing. "He's so wrapped up in his work." James's voice joined hers. "Perfect. Once we sell the house, we'll have enough to start fresh somewhere else. His money will set us up nicely." "The market's hot right now," Laura agreed. "We could list it next month. Mark will never know what hit him." Mark's hand remained steady as he recorded their conversation, capturing every damning word. His jaw clenched as they continued discussing their plans, laying bare their intentions to betray and rob him. After gathering enough evidence, Mark signaled Scout with a gentle pat. They retreated carefully through the woods, leaving no trace of their presence. Scout matched his pace perfectly, understanding the need for stealth. Back at their car, Mark checked the recording to ensure he had captured everything clearly. The audio was perfect, every word of their scheme preserved as irrefutable evidence. The drive home was quiet, with Scout resting his head on the back seat. When they arrived, Mark parked in the garage and turned to his faithful companion. Running his hand through Scout's soft fur, he smiled sadly. "It's time to end this," he said softly, giving Scout an appreciative pat. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Mark methodically prepared breakfast. His movements were deliberate and calm as he arranged everything perfectly. Fresh coffee brewing, Laura's favorite mug set out, and a plate of toast waiting on the counter. Scout lay at his feet, golden fur catching the early light, his watchful eyes never leaving the kitchen doorway. Laura's footsteps echoed down the hallway, and she appeared in her silk robe, hair slightly tousled from sleep. "Something smells good," she said, smiling as she made her way to her usual seat at the kitchen counter. Scout's low growl was barely audible as she passed. Mark poured her coffee exactly the way she liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream. He placed it in front of her without a word, then reached for the manila envelope he'd prepared the night before. Laura took a sip of coffee, still unaware of the storm about to break. With steady hands, Mark laid out the evidence one piece at a time. First, the crumpled cabin receipt. Then, the screenshots showing her and James in their backyard. Finally, his phone, queued up with the damning video footage from the previous night. "Care to explain this?" His voice was ice cold, cutting through the morning quiet. Laura's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes darted from the receipt to the screenshots, then to Mark's face. What is all this?" she stammered, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Mark pressed play on his phone. Her own voice filled the kitchen. "Mark doesn't suspect a thing." James's voice followed, discussing their plans to sell the house. The color drained from Laura's face. She set down her coffee cup with a shaky hand, coffee sloshing over the rim. "Mark, I can explain." "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady. "Explain how you and James planned to steal my money. Explain the affair. Explain all the lies." Laura's denial crumbled. "Okay, yes," she admitted, her voice small. "James and we've been seeing each other." She straightened up, her shock giving way to defensiveness. "But you're not innocent in this, Mark. You're never home. Always working late, always distracted. Do you know how lonely I've been?" Scout's growl grew louder as Laura's voice rose. Mark remained silent, letting her words wash over him. "James actually pays attention to me," she continued. "He makes time for me. When was the last time you really saw me?" Mark stood up slowly, pushing his chair back from the table. "We're done," he said simply. He grabbed his keys from the counter, the metal clinking softly in the sudden silence. "Scout, come!" he called, and the golden retriever was instantly at his side. Together they walked toward the door, leaving Laura sitting alone at the kitchen counter, her untouched coffee growing cold beside the evidence of her betrayal. Mark sat across from his lawyer, Richard Bennett, in a well-appointed office overlooking the city. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows as Mark methodically laid out the evidence he'd gathered. Scout lay quietly at his feet, offering silent support. "These videos are quite clear," Richard said, reviewing the footage on his tablet. "And the audio of them discussing financial fraud, that's particularly damning." He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and made several notes. "With this level of evidence, we can file for divorce on grounds of adultery and potential financial misconduct." Mark nodded, his throat tight. "How long will this take?" "Given the strength of our case, we can move quickly. I'll have the paperwork ready within the hour." Richard's voice was reassuring as he began typing on his computer. "We'll make sure your assets are protected." Back at the house, Mark's phone buzzed constantly with messages from Laura. He silently packed boxes while her voicemails played through the speaker. "Mark, please," Laura's voice cracked. "We can work this out. I made a mistake. Please come home." Another message followed. "I know I hurt you, but our marriage means everything to me. Can we just talk?" Mark continued packing, carefully wrapping framed photos from happier times. Scout paced near the bedroom door, his hackles rising as Laura's footsteps approached. Mark? Laura appeared in the doorway, her eyes red and puffy. Please don't do this. Scout's low growl filled the room as she took a step forward. Mark kept packing, not meeting her eyes. I ended things with James, she said desperately. It was stupid. I wasn't thinking clearly. Mark sealed another box with packing tape, the sharp sound cutting through her words. Laura moved closer, but Scout's growl deepened, causing her to step back. As Mark carried the last box to his truck, Laura followed him onto the front porch. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn as she made one final plea. Mark, please, she begged, tears streaming down her face. We can start over. I'll do anything. Mark paused at his truck, Scout already settled in the passenger seat. Without turning around, he spoke quietly but firmly. You made your choice. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, leaving Laura standing alone on the porch as he drove away. A week after moving out, Mark sat in Richard Bennett's office, surrounded by stacks of financial statements and bank records spread across the mahogany desk. His fingers traced over suspicious transactions as Scout dozed contentedly at his feet, occasionally twitching in his sleep. These renovation charges from James, Mark said, pointing to several large payments that stood out like red flags. The amounts seem inflated compared to market rates, way more than what I'd expect for basic repairs. Richard adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, examining the documents closely with practiced eyes. Indeed, look at these material costs. They're marked up nearly 3 times the retail price. No legitimate contractor would charge this much. He pulled up more records on his computer screen, scrolling through page after page. And these labor charges for work that appears minimal at best. 4 hours to replace a doorknob? 8 hours for basic garden maintenance? Mark's jaw tightened as he remembered James's frequent visits, supposedly for yard work and repairs. The memory of seeing James's truck in his driveway almost daily now filled him with anger. Laura approved all these payments while I was at work. She always said she was handling the household expenses to help me focus on my projects. This is clear financial fraud, Richard stated firmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. We need to report this to the authorities immediately. The evidence suggests Laura was complicit in helping James defraud you. This wasn't just a few overcharges. It was a calculated scheme. The next morning, Mark walked into the police station with a thick folder of evidence tucked under his arm, his heart heavy but determined. He presented everything: the security camera footage showing James's suspicious behavior, detailed bank statements showing the fraudulent charges, and damning recordings from the cabin where Laura and James discussed their scheme in hushed voices. The detective assigned to the case, a seasoned investigator named Rodriguez, reviewed the evidence carefully, making notes as she went through each document. This is quite comprehensive, Mr. Reynolds. We'll need to investigate further, but there's enough here to move forward with charges. You've done most of our work for us. Within days, the investigation revealed more victims of James's contracting scams across 3 counties. Police cars lined the quiet suburban street as officers led James out of his house in handcuffs, his usual confident smirk replaced by a look of defeat. Neighbors gathered on their perfectly manicured lawns, whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. Laura stood frozen on their former home's porch, her face pale and drawn as another officer approached her with a warrant. The detective had found hundreds of text messages and emails proving her role in facilitating James's fraud. Each message another nail in the coffin of her deception. Mark watched from his parked car across the street as James was placed in the back of a police cruiser. Scout sat alert in the passenger seat, his tail wagging as he observed the scene through the window, as if he understood the significance of the moment. Mark reached over and scratched behind Scout's ears, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingers. "We did it, buddy," he said quietly. feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness as the police cars drove away with their blue lights flashing. Time for both of us to move forward. Mark stood in the empty living room of his former home, the echoes of his footsteps bouncing off bare walls. Scout padded around the space, sniffing corners that once held furniture and memories. The "Sold" sign in the front yard marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Come on, buddy," Mark said softly. "Time for our new adventure." 3 hours north, in a quieter neighborhood with tree-lined streets, Mark unlocked the door to their new home. It was smaller than their previous house, but warm and inviting, with honey-colored hardwood floors and large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. Scout bounded through each room, his tail wagging as he explored their fresh start. Mark unpacked boxes slowly, arranging his belongings in ways that felt different from before. He placed Scout's bed near the bay window in the living room, where afternoon sun created the perfect spot for napping. The house gradually began to feel like home, untainted by betrayal and lies. Seeking purpose beyond his architectural work, Mark discovered a local animal rescue center just 10 minutes from their new home. The familiar scent of dogs and the sound of happy barks greeted him as he walked through the door with Scout by his side. Something about the energy of the place lifted his spirits. "We could use volunteers," the center manager had told him, noticing how naturally he interacted with the animals. "Especially someone with such a well-behaved dog." Mark began spending his weekends at the center, walking dogs and helping with basic care. Scout accompanied him, becoming something of a therapy dog for the more nervous rescues. Working with the animals gave Mark's healing process direction and meaning. Each wagging tail and grateful lick reminded him that love, in its purest form, still existed. One evening, while helping to clean kennels, Mark heard a new voice in the corridor. Scout's ears perked up, and he trotted toward the sound. Mark followed, finding his dog sitting attentively in front of a woman in scrubs who was kneeling to greet him. "Well, aren't you the friendliest welcome committee?" she said, scratching Scout behind the ears. Her smile was genuine and warm, reaching all the way to her eyes. "That's new," Mark said, surprised by Scout's immediate trust. "He's usually more reserved with strangers." The woman stood up, extending her hand. "I'm Emily, the new vet here, and this handsome fellow clearly has excellent judgment." "Mark," he replied, shaking her hand. "And this is Scout." He watched as Scout leaned against Emily's legs, his tail sweeping back and forth in a steady rhythm of approval. Something in his chest lifted, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't just attraction, it was a spark of possibility, of hope. The gentle rhythm of Mark's new life brought an unexpected peace. Each morning started with Scout's eager face and a walk through their tree-lined neighborhood, followed by work at his architectural firm's local branch. Weekends became his favorite time, filled with volunteer work at the rescue center where Scout had become something of a mascot among the staff and animals alike. Emily's presence at the center added warmth to their routine. She would often join them during afternoon walks, her veterinary expertise showing in the way she handled even the most difficult rescue cases. Scout trotted happily between them, occasionally nudging their hands together as if orchestrating their growing connection. "He's quite the matchmaker," Emily laughed one afternoon as Scout pushed her closer to Mark during their walk. Mark smiled, watching his dog's obvious approval. "He's always been good at reading people. Better than me, apparently." One evening, as they sat on a bench outside the rescue center after a long day of volunteering, Mark felt the weight of his past story rising to the surface. Scout rested his head on Mark's knee, offering silent support as always. "I should probably tell you about what brought me here," Mark said quietly, his hand absently stroking Scout's fur. Emily turned to face him, her expression open and attentive. Mark shared everything, The betrayal, Laura's affair, the way Scout had tried to warn him, and how his loyal companion had ultimately led him to the truth. His voice grew stronger as he described how Scout's unwavering loyalty had given him the strength to start over. "Scout knew long before I did," Mark concluded. "He tried to tell me so many times." Emily reached out and squeezed his hand gently. "Dogs have an incredible intuition about people," she said. "I've seen it countless times in my work." She paused, then shared her own story of heartbreak and healing, speaking of a relationship that had ended when her ex-partner couldn't accept her dedication to animal rescue work. Scout moved between them, offering comfort to both as they talked. The evening air grew cooler, but neither seemed to notice, wrapped in the warmth of shared understanding. A few days later, as Mark finished his volunteer shift, Emily approached him with an envelope in hand. Scout's tail wagged enthusiastically at her arrival. "The Rescue Center is holding its annual fundraising gala next month," she said, holding out the envelope. "I was wondering if you and Scout might like to come. They're allowing pets this year, and Scout would be a perfect ambassador for the center." Mark felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in his chest. The thought of a formal event brought back memories of social gatherings with Laura, but Scout's gentle nudge against his leg seemed to say, "It's okay." Looking at Emily's hopeful expression and feeling Scout's reassuring presence, Mark took a deep breath. "You know what? We'd love to come," he said, accepting the envelope. Scout barked once, as if adding his own approval to the plan. Emily's face lit up with a bright smile. "Really? That's wonderful. Scout will definitely be the best-dressed dog there." The charity gala transformed the rescue center's main hall into an elegant space filled with twinkling lights and the gentle murmur of conversation. Mark adjusted his tie nervously, while Scout padded beside him, sporting a handsome bow tie that matched Mark's outfit. The dog's calm presence helped steady Mark's nerves as they made their way through the crowd. Emily spotted them from across the room and hurried over, her blue dress flowing gracefully. "You both clean up nicely," she said, with a warm smile. Scout's tail wagged in response to her greeting. Throughout the evening, Emily introduced Mark to various colleagues and supporters of the rescue center. "This is Mark," she would say, her voice filled with pride. "He's been instrumental in our socialization program for the more anxious dogs. And this is Scout, our unofficial therapy dog." Mark felt his chest swell with quiet pride as Emily described his contributions. Several guests shared stories about their own rescue pets, and Mark found himself easily joining these conversations, sharing his experiences with genuine enthusiasm. Scout charmed everyone he met, demonstrating perfect manners as children and adults alike stopped to pet him. During a lull in the festivities, Mark and Emily found themselves in a quiet corner of the hall. Scout lay contentedly at their feet as soft music played in the background. "You know," Emily said softly, "what happened with Scout and your ex-wife? It shows something remarkable about both of you." Mark tilted his head questioningly. "Scout's loyalty to you wasn't just instinct," she explained. "Dogs give back what they receive. His dedication shows what kind of person you are, how much love and trust you've given him." Mark felt something warm spread through his chest at her words. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the usual sting when thinking about his past. Instead, he felt grateful for where it had led him. He and Emily shared a quiet smile, understanding passing between them without words. As the evening drew to a close, Mark and Scout walked home under a star-filled sky. The cool night air felt refreshing after the warmth of the gala. Scout trotted happily beside him, bow tie slightly askew from all the attention he'd received. Mark thought about how different his life looked now compared to 6 months ago. The pain hadn't disappeared completely, but it had transformed into something else. something that had led him to this new chapter, to meaningful work, to new connections. Looking down at Scout, Mark whispered, "We're going to be okay." Scout barked once in response, tail wagging as they continued their walk home. The morning mail brought an unexpected envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. Mark stood at his kitchen counter, turning the letter over in his hands, while Scout watched him intently. Taking a deep breath, he opened it and began to read Laura's words. Her letter was filled with remorse and explanations. She wrote about her regret, her shame, and how serving community service had given her time to reflect on her actions. She mentioned seeing photos of Mark volunteering at the rescue center on social media and expressed genuine happiness that he had found his path. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she wrote, "but I hope you know how sorry I am for everything." Mark folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Scout nudged his hand with his nose, and Mark scratched behind his ears, feeling surprisingly calm. He didn't feel the need to respond. Some doors were better left closed. Later that afternoon, Mark sat in his lawyer's office, signing the final paperwork that would close the case against Laura and James completely. James had pleaded guilty to fraud charges and agreed to pay full restitution. The lawyer smiled as he filed away the last document. "That's it, Mr. Reynolds. It's all finished." Walking out of the office, Mark felt lighter than he had in months. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as he and Scout made their way to the nearby park. Golden leaves crunched under their feet as they walked along their favorite path. Scout trotted happily beside him, occasionally chasing a falling leaf. The park was peaceful, with only a few other visitors enjoying the beautiful day. Near the playground, a young family played fetch with their golden retriever, their laughter carrying across the grass. Mark watched them for a moment, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was a slight ache for the family life he'd once imagined with Laura, but it was overshadowed by gratitude for what remained. He looked down at Scout, who gazed back with unwavering loyalty. "You're all I need, buddy," Mark said softly, giving Scout an affectionate pat before turning toward home. The seasons changed, and with them, Mark's life took on new colors. Emily had become a regular presence in his and Scout's daily routine, bringing warmth to their quiet evenings and weekend adventures. Scout, who had once been so protective and wary, now greeted Emily with enthusiastic tail wags and playful nudges for attention. One sunny Saturday morning, as they sat in Mark's backyard watching Scout chase butterflies, Emily turned to Mark with bright eyes. "You know, there's this beautiful hiking trail about an hour from here. Scout would love it. Lots of new smells and wide open spaces." Mark smiled, watching as Scout bounded over at the sound of his name. "That sounds perfect," he said, feeling a flutter of excitement he hadn't experienced in a long time. The following weekend found them at the trailhead, Scout practically dancing with anticipation as Mark checked their backpack supplies. Emily laughed at Scout's enthusiasm, scratching behind his ears. "Someone's ready for an adventure." As they climbed higher along the trail, Mark found himself lost in thought. The rhythmic crunch of leaves under their boots and Scout's happy exploration of every new scent created a peaceful backdrop for reflection. He thought about the past year, the pain of Laura's betrayal, the darkness that had threatened to overwhelm him, and Scout's unwavering presence through it all. Scout had been more than just a pet. He'd been a guardian angel in fur, leading Mark to the truth when he needed it most. Now, watching Scout bound between him and Emily on the trail, Mark felt a profound sense of gratitude. At the summit, they paused to rest on a fallen log. Scout darted around the clearing, playfully chasing birds that scattered at his approach. Emily passed Mark a water bottle, their fingers brushing briefly. "He's such a happy dog," Emily observed, watching Scout's joyful exploration. It's hard to imagine him as the serious detective who uncovered your ex-wife's affair." Mark nodded, feeling the familiar ache of old wounds that had finally begun to heal. "He saved me from a lot more heartbreak down the road. Sometimes I think he understood what was happening before I did." The view from the summit stretched out before them. Rolling hills painted in autumn colors, the sky a brilliant blue above. Scout returned to them, panting happily, and flopped down at their feet. As they began their descent, Scout took the lead, his tail wagging as he guided them down the familiar path. Mark felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The betrayal that had once threatened to break him had instead revealed the true meaning of loyalty through Scout and opened his heart to new possibilities with Emily. Scout barked joyfully from ahead, as if encouraging them to keep up. Emily laughed, her voice carrying through the trees, and Mark couldn't help but smile. The trail stretched before them, winding down through the colorful forest, and for the first time in a long while, Mark felt completely at home. If you enjoyed the story of Mark and Scout, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.